Hey, what's going on, everybody? Welcome to the live stream if you're joining. It has been far too long since the last time I did a live stream on Didact. So, welcome. It's been far too long. For anybody that's joining, glad to have you on. Tonight, we're going to go over some docs, and if anybody has any questions, I'll go over design choices for V1, and we can just talk about some of the upcoming features, some of the recent changes I've done to the docs, any questions about what features are going to be in V1 and so on. It's going to be good. So welcome to anybody that joins. Make sure to say hello in the chat and say hi. I'll give you a shout out. Hope you all are having a lovely Saturday night. Well, Saturday where I am. Yeah, sorry again it's been so long. Life was a little crazy there for a little while. I just wasn't able to do live streams for a good bit. And I haven't done as much marketing for Didact V1 lately because I'm just trying to get it finished as quickly as possible. That's like where all of my time and attention has been going towards, is just getting it finished as quickly as I possibly can. So rest assured, even though you haven't seen me on a live stream in a while, I have been doing a lot of work for Didact in the background. I just haven't had a chance to live stream it in a good bit. But it's a Saturday, and I was talking to my wife, and I was just like, it's been just too long since I've talked to everybody. It's time to do a live stream again and say hello to everybody. So good to see you guys. I'm going to turn the music down just a little bit. Let me turn that back up just a little bit more. There we go. All right, let's do some work tonight. Let's get some good work done on the documentation. Oh, sorry. Those energy drinks, man, they wake you up. Yeah, so what I've been working on lately is putting a lot of work into Didact CLI, because I basically come to the idea that the CLI is like a super important part of the overall platform. And the CLI is kind of going to be the one central application where you control all of the other apps that are a part of Didact. It's a pretty central piece to how you do everything inside of the Didact platform. Because again, Didact isn't a NuGet package that you're adding to a C# project. It's a set of pre-built apps that you're going to use through a CLI I'm providing for you. And then to build your Flow libraries, your .NET class libraries, there will be like one or two helper NuGet packages, but they're pretty minimal. Most of what Didact is basically pre-built apps. But yeah, I've kind of realized like it kind of makes sense to do everything through the CLI. Honestly, a CLI is a really good way to ship like a pre-built job orchestrator, kind of like what I'm wanting to do. So I just kind of thought, yeah, I need to spend some time on the documentation, just sort of developing the CLI and what that's going to do. So if you've been paying attention to the doc site, maybe you have, maybe you haven't, it has actually been getting a good bit of updates lately. And more documentation pages have been added to it. It's been cleaned up. I've just kind of been doing it sporadically, like in pieces, but it's coming together really well. The docs are actually a lot further than they were. I'm still finishing up the Getting Started page right here on the Getting Started section of the website. But core concepts, if it's been a while since you've gone through core concepts, feel free to check out the core concepts section on the doc site. I've added a lot of new pages in here, really cleaned up a lot of old pages and just re-clarified old architectural decisions I was going with that I've changed after like talking to various people. So it's good. It's looking really good. I've got a new Didact CLI page where I talk about the CLI. I've got a flow library page that kind of goes over the overview of flow libraries. And I've got a nice setup section here too. So if you don't install the various apps, the CLI, the engine, or the UI, there's different guides for all that. I've got config pages set up now that look really nice, and installation pages, so it'll show you like how to install, different apps and so on. You'll see a couple to-dos, here and there throughout the site, stuff that I'm still working on. But it's looking really good. I want this to be like super clean, super easy to read. I want it to be just like dead simple for you to use this and get started with Didact absolutely as fast as possible. My goal as the founder is I want you to be able to get Didact up and running locally on your own computer, like your dev machine. And I would say like, if I don't want it to take you any more than probably like 8 minutes, we'll say maximum. And that's including like installing Didact's apps and interacting with them. And then that's also like making your flow library. I don't want any of that to take more than like, say 8 minutes. That's kind of my goal right now as a founder, just to make things as super, easy for you as possible. So yeah, we're just kind of working through the doc site tonight. I'm finishing up a few important concepts that I need to figure out in order to ship version 1. And I would say pretty much the last thing that I'm really stuck on right now is deployments. I'm really trying to think through how I want to handle flow library deployments in the data model, because it's actually a little dicey as far as like how to capture that metadata in the Didact database and what I want to capture and what I want to do with it. I have a pretty good idea of what I want to do with all that, but I'm not like 100% sure what I want the final version to look like yet. So one of the things I'm kind of doing tonight while I'm live streaming is just sort of thinking about what I want that final deployment data model to look like. So just as a quick reminder for anybody watching, the way that it works is you create a flow library, which is a .NET class library. That's where you write all your background jobs in. And then you build and publish that library somewhere, and you create a deployment through Didact. And then when you have the engine launched on your machine, the engine will pick up that library and absorb it automatically and start executing your background jobs. That's basically the idea behind it. And it's really nice because one of the things that you'll see on the Didact engine architecture page is that I want it to be an always-on application. So if you make an update to a flow library, if you want to redeploy it because you added a job or deleted a job, or maybe like you've just updated a specific flow that you have, maybe it calls like an API or something, and the URL changed. I'm just throwing like an example out there. I don't want you to have to shut Didact engine off while all that's happening. So basically the idea is Didact engine is an always-on application, a server-side application that never stops running your background jobs. It's extraordinarily painful to architect, extraordinarily painful. It's been really, really tough getting all of this together architecturally speaking, because it is just a nasty, nasty problem to solve in .NET. But good news is, after a long time of planning through this and architecting how it's supposed to work, I think I'm onto something, and it's looking really good. I'm so pumped to get this out to all of you. I don't think anyone's tried to build something this psychotic in .NET before. I mean, it's just straight up psychotic. But I love it, right? Because that's kind of how a startup works. That's kind of, when you build an awesome dev tool, when you want to do something new and awesome for the ecosystem, you kind of have to be a little crazy, right? You got to be a little psychotic. That's not necessarily a bad thing. Good things can come out of that. So, yeah, just kind of thinking through deployments tonight, because a lot of the data model is looking fantastic. Just trying to think through how to save that data and the data model and what I want the deployment workflow to look like. That's kind of where I'm at right now. Because if you look in the getting started page, most of it's pretty straightforward. You make a flow library, you write a flow, you set up a database, run migrations, all that's pretty straightforward stuff. And then you'll install the CLI, run a couple commands to get everything set up. You'll make your first flow library. You'll add some project configurations and whatnot. I'm going to update this page tonight or tomorrow. You'll install the engine. You'll install the UI. But then you've got to deploy the library somewhere. And that's kind of where I'm at right now. I'll show you guys some updates on the API side with the CLI. You can see I have a whole list of new CLI commands that have shown up here that are looking really good. So you probably haven't seen this stuff before because these pages didn't exist previously. I've only just recently added these in the last couple weeks, and I really like the way it's feeling so far. So if you look on the nav bar on the left, you'll see different commands that I offer. I've got config init commands and set commands. I've got inspect commands so that you can look at config files. I've got engine install commands, UI install commands, environment commands. I'm trying not to overdo it for the first version because I don't want to have, any more than absolutely necessary. But, to be honest, even these set of commands that you see on here, they're pretty necessary. All of them are honestly pretty important to have. So the way that, just as a quick reminder, the engine and the CLI and the UI work is they're pre-built self-contained binaries. And you can modify them with what I would call a runtime config file or a runtime, environment variable file. And so the way that you do that is you have config commands for each app. So you'll notice we have a config set command for the CLI. We have a config set command for the engine. And then we have one for the UI as well. And if you go to these pages, for example, let's say we'll go to the CLI's config set command page. So you notice it's pretty straightforward stuff. You just type something in your terminal and you set an environment variable. I think it's pretty straightforward for the most part, where you do a key name and a value. These actually correspond to a JSON file. So the way that these pre-built apps work for you is each app basically has a config file that's JSON, and you can either copy and paste the JSON from the website and paste it in VS Code or something, and you can just write all of your app settings and environment variables there. But you can also use the CLI command, the config set command you saw a second ago, and you can just key in one terminal command at a time, all the different config values you want to set. This is kind of nice because you can just do everything through the CLI, and then you can automate everything with CI/CD processes. So if you have scripts that you want to run, say in GitHub Actions, or if you have any other kind of CI/CD process that runs when you deploy architecture, the nice thing is you can automate all of this stuff with a CLI, all of the different configs that the engine, the CLI, and the UI might need. And I think that's really nice for automation, developer experience and all that kind of stuff. So what's nice is I have a nice master config file page for each app. So you notice on the left here, we've got a CLI config page, an engine config page, and then a UI config page. And if you read through each of these pages, it'll show you what the JSON file is supposed to look like and what the different config values are. And then I've got a little table at the bottom where it shows you what each JSON key is on the left here, what type of value you're supposed to put in, and then just a little description about what the value is supposed to be. And if any of the values need any further notes added to them, then I put little sections for them down at the bottom. I actually have put a lot of work into building these pages a certain way. It may not look like much, if you're looking at this, but I want these to be super search engine friendly. I want web crawlers with Google and everywhere else to be able to crawl these things super easily. So I'm trying to set all this up in a way where it's just really fast and easy for you to find any docs that you might need. So anyway, that's just a couple overviews, probably stuff you've heard of or maybe you haven't heard of, depending on how much of the docs you've seen. But yeah, that's kind of where we're at right now. So what I'm trying to figure out tonight, along with cleaning up a few docs, is just trying to think about what to do about deployments, how I want to handle those for the flow libraries. Really thinking through that right now. Maybe we'll talk about the data model for a minute. We can start there. You have to let me apologize. I've got some unsaved changes that are committed right now. Let's I think most of these are namespace things. Can I not pull this down from Git? Let's see if I can pull that. Of course not. Okay, we're just gonna zap all these changes. I don't think it's anything I necessarily need right now. Bring everything back down. Perfect. Okay. Now we are nice and back up to date. So yeah, let's talk about the data model for a minute. So this is kind of what I was talking about in regards to how I want to handle the data model. So right now, I've got two different concepts in the data model that I'm trying to deal with regarding deployments. The first entity is a library, and the second one is a library deployment. And what I'm trying to figure out right now is that really necessary? Do I actually need that right now? Or is that not really, like a requirement? I think that's kind of what I'm stuck on right now. Do we need a separate library table, or is a library deployment table, more than sufficient for everything that we need? That's kind of what I'm trying to think through. Right now, in the Didact CLI, the only commands that I've got planned is a deployment command. But I'm trying to figure out if I can zap this library entity, and make the data model a little bit more simple. I think the tricky part right now is, like, conceptually, I've been thinking about a library and a library deployment as two different things. That's why I've got two entities here. Because technically, you could have a library where, like, let's say you've got two different versions of the library. So let's say, like, at 8 a.m. today, you deploy the first version of the library and it's got a background job in it, right? So let's say we add the library to the data model, you make a deployment for that library so it's up and running in Didact Engine. And then let's say a couple hours later, you add another background job. So now you've got two background jobs in the same library, right? So what do we do? Do we make like a whole new library record and a whole new library deployment record as well? Or like, what do we do? Because, like, your first library could still be running in Didact Engine right now, but now you've got an updated background job that you've added to it, and you want to deploy the new version of your library, right, to Didact Engine so it can start running both your background jobs. How do we handle that in the data model? Like, what do we want that to look like? And that's kind of what I'm going over right now. I'm trying to think, like, what's the simplest, most sensible way to handle that. I don't feel like every time you update a library, you would necessarily want a new library record. I think every time you make a flow library, we can just leave it as a, as a library record and just leave it there. Just call it a library entity and just kind of leave it alone. And no matter how many changes your library undergoes, whether you've got like one library, and that's all you've got, and you've only got one version for it. I guess I'm talking in circles. Let me restart my sentence here. Think about what I'm saying. Yeah, I guess what I'm trying to figure out is, like, when you make updates to a flow library, conceptually, what do we want that to look like in the data model? That's really what I'm trying to figure out. And I'm also thinking about, like, your deployment sources, like where you're putting the libraries. What do we want to do about that? So here we go. Here's a new example. Okay. let's say that you've got a flow library with a background job. So you publish it to a server folder that Didact Engine can find. So your library is this, flow library that you've got, a .NET class library, and you're publishing it to like a server folder that Didact Engine can access. So even if you add background jobs, delete background jobs, or update background jobs, it's all still in the same library. Like, it's still a part of the same, .NET class library. None of that is changing. And no matter how many times you make updates to it, and no matter how many times you keep publishing it, the library is going to keep getting sent to the same deployment source. You're going to keep sending it to the same, server, like network, shared folder the Didact Engine can access. You're going to keep sending it there no matter how many updates you make. So, your library doesn't change as far as like the name of it. The contents of it will change as you do things to your background jobs, but the library itself won't change, like as far as the metadata for it, if that makes sense. And where you're deploying it, that's not really going to change either, because you're going to keep sending the library, over and over and over again, back to the same, deployment source. Ideally, you're going to keep sending it back to that same network folder. So yeah, I'm just trying to think, like, how do we actually want to handle that in the data model? Surely, like, every time you make a change to a flow library, you don't necessarily want to make a new deployment, right? I don't know. That's the tricky thing, right? Like, how do we want to handle that? The other thing that I've got is I didn't want to deal with this for version 1, and I actually had some early adopters tell me not to worry about it for version 1, but I'm kind of at the point where I'm not sure if it's actually like avoidable or not. I don't want to deal with this for version 1, but I'm not sure if I have a choice, if that makes sense. But because C# is not a scripting language and individual files can't be run as their own programs, well, they couldn't when I started building Didact. Actually, with .NET 10, you can do single file runs now with the .NET CLI, which is pretty cool. Before that, you couldn't do it. And even still, I mean, it's useful, but it's not as powerful as a job orchestrator is. So, what you do is you create background jobs in your flow library. But see, your flow library will have a version assigned to it because it's a .NET class library. It'll have the assembly version attached to it. But like, just because, like, let's say you have 2 flows in the library, you may change the second flow and you won't change the first one, right? So like, how do we deal with versioning? When your second flow is changing, but your first flow isn't, you don't really want to say like you have a new version for the first flow, because you don't. It's still the same version. It's just the second flow that changed, right? But again, like, flows are classes inside of a flow library. They're not like individual as far as like the assemblies go. They still belong to the same containing assembly from the library that they're inside of. So like, how do you deal with versioning? That's been one of the ugliest problems that I've been trying to solve with Didact for so long, is like, how do we deal with versions? Best thing I could come up with was what I'm calling an execution version. So if you look on the left, you'll notice there's an entity called execution version I've got on my screen. And I'm kind of making it like a composite, where it's a combination of the library version, which would be the assembly version of the .NET class library. And then when you configure a flow in the configure async method, you would add an individual string version to each flow. And ideally, what would happen is like, you would only get a new execution version for a flow when either the flow's version changes or the library's version changes. And if the library version doesn't change, and if the flow's version doesn't change, then you don't get a new execution version, and it just stays the same that it previously was. that's kind of the idea behind the execution version. Again, it's tricky because, flows are isolated to classes, but one class library could have a million classes in it. So we've got two different concepts that we're trying to track as far as like how the .NET architecture itself is set up. Classes are contained inside of a class library, but both of them could have things that change. And so it's like, setting up tracking for them is just really ugly. So that's kind of where I'm at right now. That's kind of what I'm trying to figure out is like, essentially just, how do we want to handle that? Various people said, don't even worry about it. You shouldn't even deal with like an execution version on the first, version of Didact. It's too complicated and like people may not necessarily need it. The only problem is like, I don't want to make it any worse for myself than I have to either. But the only issue is like, I'm not sure if I can put it off. This seems like something that's kind of like a baseline requirement, even for like a V1. I don't know. That's kind of where I'm at tonight. I'm trying to think through like, how do we want to deal with that? Let me show you just an update, or a reminder, I should say, of what the flows look like. So when you create a flow has two different parts to it. So when you write a flow, you've got two methods you implement. You make a class and you implement an interface called iFlow. And then iFlow has two methods that you implement. You've got a configure async method and you've got an execute async method. The configure method is like setting up the flow, and the execute is like what the flow is actually supposed to do. So in the configure method, you can add things like names, descriptions. You can add like version indicator, like some kind of version string. If you want to do triggers, like say you have a cron schedule or multiple cron schedules or something like that, if you want to add triggers, ideally you can add triggers inside of the configure async method. That's kind of the idea behind it. It's like a setup hook for basically setting up your flows. And then when it's time to like actually write, what your flow does, that's where the execute async method comes from. So for example, going back to like the getting started page, let's say this is like an example configure, async method that you call. This is just like setting up the flow. But then down here, say in the execute async method, in this example, this would be like a dead, simple like flow execution. You just log something, you do a wait task.delay for 5 seconds, and then you say, okay, it's complete now. Something like dead simple. So you can kind of see the outline of flow. You inject your dependencies up here in the constructor. You set up the flow's metadata with the configure async method. And then whatever the flow is actually supposed to do, that's what the execute async method is. Pretty straightforward stuff, I think, for the most part. But yeah, the tricky part is just sort of thinking through, like, again, the versioning, right? Like deployments and the versioning. How exactly do we want to handle that? That's kind of what I'm thinking through tonight. Between libraries, library deployments, and execution versions. How do we want to do that? That's kind of where we're at. Let me pull up Notion here. I'm trying to look back through some old feedback that I got from people who had asked about execution versions. I think some people had told me previously like they weren't necessarily that worried about it. Again, it's tough because it's one of those things where it's like, I feel like you have to figure it out like early on so you know what to do going forward. If I don't include it now, I'm not sure if it's going to be very easy to throw it in later. I mean, it's a very premium feature. This is part of what's going to make Didact so powerful and good. But my gosh, it's just so ugly to make. You know, it's so painful to create yourself. So that's kind of where we're at tonight. Trying to figure out what to do about that. You know, because you can see like our flow version entity. With the flow version, you've got a database record that will get created for it, and your version is a string. And a default will get sent up if you don't specify a version. So that's kind of the tricky part right now. It's just kind of thinking through that, right? You got your flow version, which is basically just a string. You've got your library version. That's a different entity too. And that's a string as well. That would be the assembly version of the flow library. So that's what I was talking about a second ago. That is that's a .NET like built-in like metadata field. Whenever you make assemblies, which are class libraries, they have, or really it's anything. It could be like an app. It could be a class library. It could be like whatever you want it to be. The point is, like in the .NET architecture, those eventually compile into assemblies, and those assemblies have versions attached to them. So this field right here, this assembly version field, is basically directly connected to, you know, the built-in assembly version that comes from like a compiled .NET project of some kind, a class library, an app, you know, whatever it is. So yeah, the idea is you have a library version, you have a flow version, and when you put them together, that makes what you call an execution version for a flow. And that way you can track changes for, you know, pretty much everything. And this is kind of important because it ties into flow runs. Because when you execute a flow run, it will be useful for you to remember what version of the flow you're pulling from. You know, is it version 1 of the flow? Is it version 2? Is it version 50? You know, what is it? So that's why I say it's kind of an essential idea to figure out early on, because it's something you can attach to a flow run. And that is kind of important, you know. It's kind of important to figure that out early on. So, yeah, just trying to think through, like, how do we want to handle that? You know, do we just, I don't know, do we absolutely 100% have to have that? I don't know. I guess that's really the tricky question to think about, right? Like, how do we want to handle that? I guess I was thinking, like, you know, when you make changes to your flow library or your flows, you will want to see, like, what am I trying to say here? You would want to see like an aggregate list of when your flow ran, including the different versions it may have. You know, the point being that it's still tied to the same like master flow object, you know, the same entity in the database. But like say on Monday you ran version 2 50 times, and on Thursday you ran version 3 20 times. In my mind, when I conceptualize this like in the dashboard, you would want to see the same master flow entity, and then you would want to go through its run history and see like what run was associated with what version. And that way you have a nice like aggregate list of all the different versions of your flow sort of displayed on one web page to make things nice and aggregated for you. And that's why this is why the data model is just so complex, because I'm trying I'm trying to build this in such a way where it's sensible for what you would want to see on the dashboard. Like, what would you, the user, want to see? That's kind of what I'm working through with this. You know, I've thought about getting rid of the execution version completely. The only issue is, like, how do you track changes to a library? You know, how do you know when something changes? You know what I mean? The other thing too is like deployments. What do we do about deployments? You know, and that goes back to the earlier conversation. I'm just trying to think through, like, how exactly do I actually want to handle that? I'm not like 100% sure. What do I want to do about that right now? We could say, for example, like a deployment that takes place inside of Didact. I don't know. What am I trying to say here? So, like, how could we simplify this, you know, if we didn't want to go with the execution version, you know, concept? Let's say we wanted to make this easier. What's like an alternative way to think about this? How would we want to do that? It's a good question. So let's go back to my earlier example. So you have a flow library and you have a flow inside of it. The flow library has a version, the flow has a version. Let's say like they're both v1. You publish that to a network folder Didact Engine can access. So when it's time to run the flows, Didact Engine would go look inside that network folder. It would pull your flows out and start executing them in the background, right? Okay, so if you add a flow to your flow library, you would be changing the library itself because you'd be adding a flow to it, right? But you wouldn't be changing the first flow. You're just adding a new flow to the library. So let's say you build a library. Let's say you republish it to the same, you know, network folder again. Didact Engine will already have the first version of your flow library running inside of its memory cache. Like, it will already be loaded inside of a assembly load context, and I've got a whole plugin system built into Didact Engine to load these flow libraries. So, like, let's say, you know, your first version of the flow library from earlier, it's already running in Didact Engine. Okay, but now you've published a new flow library to the same source. Like, you're publishing it a second time to the same exact network folder. So the question is, like, you know, how would that work conceptually? Would you just overwrite the same files again? You know, so if you have like a DLL and let's say like 3 DLL files, right? One DLL is the main DLL for the flow library. And then, like, let's say the other 2 DLLs were like, I don't know, like NuGet packages or something that you add, right? So when you build your flow library, you've got 3 DLL files. They all get sent back to the same network drive location again, you know, the same shared network folder. There's no reason Didact Engine would grab it out of the same network folder again, because it already loaded the first version of your library earlier, right? So how do we get the engine to start, loading the new version of your flow library? How do we get that to work, right? That's kind of where the concept of a deployment comes in. If we created a new deployment for your flow library, or we just updated, like, let's say the latest version of the deployment, like let's say there's just a new deployment version or something like that got saved to the database. Well, if the engine is checking deployments every so often, Didact Engine could say like, oh, hey, this flow library that I'm already running on its old version, now I see that like there's a new deployment or a new deployment version, like whatever we want to call it. And like I need to go grab it from the network folder again and load it as, like a new assembly load context and whatnot. That could work. Like that could work. The flow library could be loaded as a new plugin inside Didact Engine. So you'd have the old version running and you would have the new version running both, side by side. The only thing is, like, I don't know, what am I trying to say? Like, let's think about like the queuing system, right? Like, let's say there's a cron schedule. So like, how would we deal with version changes? Let's say when you've got an old version of the flow and now you've deployed, a new version of the flow. As far as the queuing system inside of Didact Engine goes, like, you would still have, like, let's say the first version of your flow had a cron schedule, and let's say the second version of your flow had a cron schedule as well, right? The first version is still going to get queued up inside of Didact's queue tables unless we do something to change that, right? Unless we stop that or we change that or something. And so, like, how would we do that? That's another thing I'm kind of trying to think through. I mean, ideally, you could have like a CLI command where you disable a previous version. That's one idea. Another idea, you could have a policy where you have like a specific version policy that we could set for a given flow, or maybe like a flow library. I don't know if we'd want that to be like a library thing or a flow thing. I'm not really sure what the idea here would be. I think the idea here would be like, what if we set a version policy so that based off of like what the policy is, we could determine how many concurrent versions of the same flow you want running. But see, I don't even know if that's really necessary, like architecturally speaking, because I don't know why you would want two simultaneous versions of the same flow running, at the same time. If your flow has a new version and you want that, let's say like, you want that flow published, right? You want that flow published to, you want it published to the same deployment location. And now you want the new version of your flow running, right? Because you made an update to it. Even if your flow library's version didn't change, the flow itself changed. And let's say like you added like a new version to it, right? Okay, fair enough. Well, okay, in that case then, right? You wouldn't want the old version of your flow to keep getting re-queued in the system. I feel like the only thing you'd ever want is the latest version. So version 1 of the flow was queued up 10 times already, and you deploy version 2. I guess that's fine. Like, you can leave the V1, flow runs just where they are if you want to. I guess that's fine, and they'll just have to bleed out unless you cancel them first or something like that. But like, going forward, you would only want the most recent, flow version to be running. I can't think of a reason why you would want an old version of a flow running when you publish a new version. Like isn't that the whole point? You publish a new version of the flow because you've got to change. You don't want the old one to keep running anymore. So I don't know. I take that back. I don't think an execution version policy is something that's really required. It really doesn't make sense, but to run the latest version of any given flow. If you have a V1 and a V2, why would you keep requeuing V1 when you've published V2? Like, if you publish V2, that's the only one that you're going to want to have run anymore. Like, that's it. From now on, anything that's queued up in the scheduler, you'll only want that to be V2 going forward. So I can't think of a reason why, you would want V1 to be the thing that keeps on going, as far as the queuing system goes. So a policy is overkill. I don't think we need to add that kind of an entity, to the data model. Let's just assume you always want the latest version of any given flow running in the queuing system. And that's a sensible assumption to make, given how I've seen pretty much every other background job system and job orchestrator, run. I can't think of a reason why you would want an execution version policy where like multiple versions of the same flow are running concurrently. If there's a new version, then just run the new version from now on. As far as like, you can bleed out old versions that may be loaded into flow libraries already, but as far as the queuing system goes, we would only queue the latest version of a flow. We wouldn't want to queue any more recent versions, if that makes sense. So I think that makes sense. Again, though, like what is the easiest way to handle all this versioning, right? Do we really need an execution version, or can we make it simpler? Let's say that we got rid of the execution version concept completely, and we got rid of the flow version concept, and we got rid of the library version concept. And like, let's say we got rid of the library concept too. Let's just say the only entity in the data model is a deployment, and that's all it is, right? So like, all you've got is a deployment, and that's it. How would we handle that, right? How would we handle that? That's the question, isn't it? How would we handle that? Do we make... If you wanted to track version differences with your flows in that case, if I got rid of all those entities that I was just talking about, what I'd have to do is basically have like a deployment version entity instead. Either like every change is literally a new deployment, or you make a deployment, which is sort of like, okay, here's what the library is and here's where you can find it, like that kind of metadata. And then like, let's say we have like a deployment, I don't know, like a push table or like a version table or something like that. And then like, either every time, you update a flow or you change something in the flow library, you literally have to make a new deployment every single time without question. That's one option. Or a second option is you update the deployment, like say with like a GUID or something, and it makes like a new version in the deployment history, let's say. And then Didact Engine would periodically check the database to see if there's new deployment versions that it could grab or new deployments it could grab out of the database. And that way it's always loading the most recent flow libraries that it possibly can. Man, that is really the tricky part. This is what I'm stuck on. I'm basically just trying to figure out this last part of the data model, and then I can finally get, a V1 out hopefully very soon. It's the deployments though. Like, what is the best way to handle this? If you're watching this, let me know if you got any ideas about what you think would be a good, architectural step. It's really dicey, thinking about this. It's very, very dicey thinking about how to set this up. Again, it comes back to the fact, okay, that you have a flow library and you have flows inside the flow library. And where the magic happens is at the flow level, but that's just a class in C#. It's contained inside of a .NET class library, which is, your flow library. So it's just so dicey because, your logic for each background job is at the class level, but the classes are contained at the class library level. And so there's just various options for version tracking I could offer, to make that experience as seamless as possible. That is the crux of the last part of the data model. How do we handle deployments, right? How do we handle deployments? Maybe it would help if we write this out. That might make things a little bit easier. Let's write this out and see if maybe we can make a little bit more sense of this stuff. Stuff's just crazy confusing. I have to keep chugging my energy drink here. So we can just figure out kind of how we want to handle this. Maybe we could do like a deployment data models page. How about that? Data model ideas. Let's do deployment data model ideas. All right, let's do that. Okay. So what are the different ideas that we've got? Well, let's break these out into pieces, right? So what's the current version that I've got right now? Or like what's the first idea? So idea number 1. Here's the entities that we have. We've got the flow version, the library version, the execution version, which is a combination of those two. You've got the library entity, you've got the library deployment entity, and that's basically everything. So the workflow would be assign a version to each flow library and each flow inside of each flow library. These version compositions would render all execution versions related to the flows in a given flow library. Okay, that's the first idea. I probably got a little more to add, but we can come back to it in a second. Second idea, let's go back through the entities again. So what if instead of all of that junk, right, what if we had like let's say we had deployments. We'll stick with the naming. We'll say library deployments. Library deployment. So that's the entity, right? Okay. And then you can have like library deployment version, let's say. So the workflows would be what? So instead it would be more like, if we got rid of the flow version and the library version, no assigning versions to the flow libraries, neither to the flows inside of the flow libraries. Instead, versioning is encapsulated strictly at the library deployment version level. So every time a flow changes or something inside of a flow library changes, you would push a new library deployment if it's the first time for a, well, no, it would be more like it would be a version. You would push a new library deployment version via Didact CLI. If a given flow library has never had a deployment, has never had a library deployment created for it, then it would auto-create the library. We'll say, be specific here. Then Didact CLI would auto-create the library deployment and auto-create the first library deployment version. Then each flow run would correspond to a given library deployment version. Problems. What about aggregating flow runs from different library deployment versions? So with this idea, with idea number 2, basically every single time that you would change something in a flow library, or like add a flow, delete a flow, update a flow, whatever, you'd basically have to make a new deployment version. Whether it's the first time you're making a deployment version for that flow library or not, you would basically have to make a new deployment version and have the Didact CLI add that as a record to the database. Goodness me. And then if you're looking at like a flow run history page, basically every flow run would be tied to a library deployment version. I don't know how I feel about that. I don't know how I feel about that. That doesn't make me feel super great, to be honest with you. Not a big fan. I'm not a big fan of that. That's tough. That's a really tough one. I think I don't like that data model idea, because if you have to make like a new library deployment version every time anything changes, you're never going to know what changed. It seems like it would be useless, version tracking, because like if you have two flows inside of a flow library, if there is no version at like the flow level, if it's all just encapsulated at this deployment entity, then like every time anything changes, it's going to be a whole new deployment version, but you're never going to, like, that's useless information, I feel like, because like the flow run will say like, well, this belongs to like a different deployment version, but that doesn't tell you anything. Like that doesn't tell you anything about like what changed. Like what actually changed. And you don't know. You just know that it's a different version. Isn't that kind of useless though? Like, I don't know. Is that not useless? Is that not pointless? I would think. Like, is that even useful, to you? What's even the point of the version tracking? Because like it's not even going to tell you anything. I feel like that just does nothing for you. On the flip side, because there would be a new library deployment version, for every individual change in a flow or a flow library that it's encapsulated in, Didact Engine would know that it's always got to grab a fresh version from like, wherever the deployment source is. So I guess you could say like that's a plus, right? Like Didact Engine at least Didact Engine would know that it needs to grab the library from the given source again. It would at least know that. So I guess that's I guess that's a plus side. I don't know. The other thing I'm kind of thinking through is like, what happens when you keep redeploying to the same what happens when you keep redeploying to the same source? Like going back to my initial example, let's say that you have like a shared, network drive where your flow libraries get published to. So you publish a flow library to this network folder, right? And it's in its built state. So you've got the libraries DLL. Let's say you've got 2 other DLLs. All those get thrown to the deployment source, right? Some network folder. And then you want to publish the library again, like a couple hours later. How do we do that? Do we just override all of the, file contents in, in that network drive? Do we just override everything? Do we delete the old version, and replace it with the new version? And how does Didact Engine handle that? You know what I mean? Because how does it know what to grab? This is what I'm talking about, guys. This is the last ugly piece of the data model that I've really just trying to think through. What makes the most sense here? What is the easiest way to deal with this? Well, we can go over what happens. Like, let's say, when a Didact engine grabs a flow library, so what it would do is it would grab all the necessary DLLs, and then when the DLLs are grabbed, okay, what would happen then would be, so let's say Didact Engine, go back to my example, it grabs all the DLLs out of the shared network folder. It'll create a runtime folder local to wherever the engine is running, and it will create all like a dedicated runtime folder for that specific, library deployment that it's grabbing. And it'll stuff all the contents into that folder at runtime. Like, let's say Didact Engine just kind of does all that automatically just in the background. That's basically how I'm going to do plugins. Plugins are basically DLL files that are loaded and resolved through an assembly load context inside of Didact Engine. So every flow library will basically go in its own runtime folder and then funneled through a respective assembly load context that loads the plugin dynamically. So Didact Engine grabs the published contents of the flow library. It shoves them into a runtime created deployment folder that's encapsulated in a set of plugin entities, not entities, I should say plugin models, I guess, in Didact Engine. That gets loaded through a funneled assembly load context. That's how the plugin becomes accessible to Didact Engine. When that happens, I do some assembly searching, and I find all of the iFlow classes that implement the iFlow interface, inside of your flow library, and I instantiate them one at a time, and I run the configure async method for each individual flow. They all get configured to the database. Any errors for flows that were unable to be configured successfully get logged to the console or a file or a database or something somewhere. Just, we'll keep it pretty easy for the most part. Let's just say that gets logged somewhere. Okay. So all of the ones that were successful, they get saved to the database. Corresponding triggers are updated or created, inside the database. Let's say the queuing system starts scheduling up flows, right? And flow runs start getting queued up in the queuing system. That would essentially happen once all of the flows are configured, to the database. Yeah, but how to handle the deployments and the versioning? I'm trying to think, like, what are the different places, you would deploy your flow library? So you could do it on a local folder. Let's say you could do it from a GitHub repo, or you could even do it from like an S3 bucket, right? Well, let's say, you publish the flow library to that local folder, or like say a shared network folder. Like I said a second ago, what you would do is override the contents. I would think you would probably override the contents of whatever, flow library files were inside that folder. You would override those when you deploy a new version of your library. Those would get overwritten somehow. Okay, fair enough. So Didact engine or engines, if you're running them in a cluster, they would want to grab this latest deployment from that target now. And they're going to need to know they can actually run the flows, that are inside that library successfully. Let's go back to, like, say the flow library example, right? Let's just say you've got the same flow library that's loaded into memory twice inside of Didact engine. Okay? The first version of the flow library is missing flow number 2, but the second version of the flow library that's loaded into memory, it has, version number 2. So if Didact engine has both of these loaded into memory, right, it's going to grab flow runs from the database that it's compatible to run. But how's it going to know, what's compatible to run and what's not, right? How does it know? Let's say we go back to idea number 1, where we've got a flow version, a library version, and an execution version. So, like, in that case, right, basically, my idea would be when plugins get loaded into Didact engine through its plugin system, it would have an array of compatible execution versions that it can run. Let me see if I can find it in Didact. I think it's in Didact engine, if I'm not mistaken, in the plugins folder. Let's look at, say, the iPlugin container interface, right? So look right here on my right-hand side of my screen, line number 9. So I'd basically have a collection of plugin execution versions. And if you look at what this class is, this is basically the execution version that you would find, inside the database. You'd have a flow type name, a library assembly name, the flow type names from the flow table, the library assembly names from the library table, and then you've got a library version table, and you've got a flow version table, and that's where those two fields come from. So it's basically a combination again, of the execution version. And what you'd have to do is match up the type name, the version, the assembly name, and the assembly version. And basically, like Didact Engine would have its own whitelist of what flow run execution versions it can actually execute when it's looking inside the queuing system. That's kind of the idea behind that. I'm not gonna lie to you though, that is ugly. I mean, that is really, oh man, that's unpleasant. I'm telling you guys, this is what I'm stuck on. If I could just get past this one concept, we'll be solid to get V1 out, hopefully fairly quick. But I've got to figure this out first, before we can publish V1. This is kind of what I'm stuck on right now. Because again, the point is, like, one of my main goals with this is I don't want you to have to shut off Didact Engine. I just don't. I want it to be an always-on application. So if we go back to core concepts and we look at Didact Engine, one of the things that I want is I want it to be always on. I don't want you to ever have to shut it off, just because you add a flow, delete a flow, update a flow, or like you have a whole new flow library. I don't want the engine to have to shut off, to make that happen. Wow. It's hard to sort of see through this workflow and see like what really does make the most sense. I'll tell you guys, this is a really tough one. Just make sure that's really does make the most. Okay, sorry about that. Darn picture doesn't load for some reason on the site. Yeah. So what do we want to do here? What does make the most sense, from a deployment idea? Idea one, idea number two. Is there some other architecture that's easier even than what I'm suggesting? That truly is the tricky part, Somehow Didact has to know when... Yeah, I don't know. I keep going back to my Didact Engine example, okay? if you have a flow library that's loaded with only the first flow, but the second flow in the flow library comes in like the second deployment, let's say, you know, we're going to run into problems in Didact Engine when it's trying to execute those flow runs. If it accidentally grabs flow runs, it can't even execute, you know, because it's got an old engine version or something that's loaded into it. I mean, it just doesn't make sense, you know. What'll happen is if Didact Engine grabs flow runs, it can't actually run because it doesn't have those flows, you know, those execution versions, let's say, loaded into memory. Okay, that's going to be an issue because what will happen then is it'll grab flow runs it's just incompatible to run against. And that's not going to be good. It'll basically like nullify or it'll break its own queuing system. Not a big fan of that. Not a big fan. And like I was saying a second ago, I think the other tricky part is going to be like whenever you deploy a flow library somewhere, you're not really going to change the deployment target or the deployment source every time a new version gets pushed up, you know, via a deployment. The source or the target's not going to change. You know, if it does change, I would say that's reasonable to assume like that's a new deployment. You know what I mean? Like if the source changes or the target of the deployment changes, that's kind of a new deployment is sort of the way I've been thinking about it. So, you know, with that assumption in mind, you would ideally keep deploying to the same network folder. Going off my earlier example, you would keep deploying to the same, you know, Git repo, the same S3 bucket, the same whatever. Right? Like wherever it is you're deploying, you're gonna keep sending the same files there, you know, over and over again. Okay, so like inevitably, right? That means that what's going to happen is like the old files are just going to be overwritten with the new files. And if we're not careful, you know, Didact Engine is going to grab, if you're running the Didact Engine is like saying a cluster, they're going to run, or they're going to grab like the newer versions, you know, of the flows. They're going to grab the newer versions and it's just going to be kind of tricky. Yeah, you know, I guess the problem though is like, once again, right? Like, I don't know, is that as big of an issue as I'm thinking it is? Well, we made a few notes, right? We talked about a few. We talked about a few architectural ideas, earlier. Let's go back to let's go to live stream notes. Let's make a couple notes about this. Okay. Live streaming. We'll do let's make a new page. Make some notes. Live stream number 4. Okay, so what are the notes that we're making here? Well, we are going to always use a default execution version policy for all flow runs in all flow libraries. The policy is this. Didact's, what should I say? Didact's queuing system will only ever queue flow runs with the most recent execution version. Is that fair to say? I don't know. Is that fair to say? Does that make sense? Does that actually make sense, or am I mistaken here? Didact's queuing system will only ever queue flow runs with the most recent execution version. I think that makes sense. This makes sense. This makes sense because, for example, if some flow has a V1 and a V2 that are both deployed, there's no reasonable expectation for me to have where the user would want to continue and queuing. Let's see, continue and queuing the older V1. Instead, the user would only want to enqueue the newer V2 going forward. I think that makes sense. That makes sense. I think I get that. So we're always going to have a default execution version policy. So do not make an execution version. Do not make an execution version policy entity. This is the mandatory default. I think that makes sense. Okay, what else? You know, I had an idea that just struck me. To be completely honest with you, I just kind of had an idea hit me while we've been talking about this for so long. Let's go to the example flow, where I think it's in Didact Core. I've got a dummy flow in there somewhere. Yeah, let's do that. Let's look at the dummy flow. Oh, right. Okay, because I've got the screens split with each other. Okay, that's fine. Let's look at the dummy flow. So I know on the flow configurator, you know, one of the values that I'll have is the type name of the flow, which, you know, that makes sense. Yeah, I mean, I think that makes sense. So question for you. This isn't a part of the flow configurator, but just bear with me. What if we had like a with what if we did like a with version? Okay, and then what we want to do is we want to do some kind of version in there, right? We'll say we've got two things, right? The flow version, let's call it V1, I don't know, version 1, something like that. And then we've got the flow library version. We could say, for example, that would be assembly dot get assembly dot. Oh, I'm missing an argument there. Oh no, okay, that's not it. What am I? Assembly dot. Do you not have a what am I trying to say here? I want to get the current assembly, right? Well, I mean, okay. We could just do like assembly dot get assembly. We could do the type name, let's say, of the flow that we're working with. You know what? I'm going to make this full screen because it's a little hard to see what we're doing here. Let's do this full screen. There we go. A little hard to see with the screens broken up. So that's a system.version type, but probably want to do that to like a string. Okay, so both of these would be a string. This is a string, this is a string. That makes sense. They're both nullable strings, basically. Okay. So string.concat. Let's do both of those together, right? Okay. And then you could do concatenated version, let's say, you know, inside of a with version method call. I mean, I guess the question is, you know, does it make sense? I guess that's the question, right? The question is like, does it make sense? I'm almost wondering, like, wow, that's a good question. Do we even need a library table, and do we need a library version table? Or is the only thing that we need one version connected at the flow level, and that's it? Is that the only thing that we need? Oh, wow. Because, like, okay, here's an idea. Let's say that you make a deployment, right? So you send a flow library somewhere to, like, say, a shared network drive. And let's say you have a deployment artifact file of some kind, like, say, a deployment.json file. And whenever you push a new deployment up, let's say it would have like a GUID. Okay, let's say it would have a GUID with the most recent deployment push. So like, let's say when you make a deployment, you always need to push it kind of like you do in Git. And whenever you push it, you make like a new, you know, a new unique ID. Like, let's say like a GUID, for example. You make a new GUID, right? Okay. Let's say that you don't have a deployment version table. Let's just say you have a deployment table and you've got a string field or a GUID field in there that has, like, I don't know, the most recent push ID or something like that, right? Like a deployment has a push command to it, and those pushes have IDs connected, kind of like the way Git does it, right? This is kind of similar to the Git CLI. Okay. So Didact Engine would check the deployments table periodically, and it would probably need to keep a cached list of all the deployments it has loaded into memory and what the push ID of those deployments would be. And if it ever finds a deployment from the database with a newer push ID, or let's just say, not even newer, let's just say it's a newer version of a library, it's already loaded, or it's just a brand new library completely, right? So it finds a push ID up in the database it doesn't have loaded into memory. It's going to know it needs to go fetch that deployment and load it into the runtime memory, right? Okay. So let's say it reaches out, it gets the deployment, it brings your class library in, you know, your built flow library, all the DLLs come in, the deployment artifact file, let's say that comes in with it. All right, fair enough. So it's going to go through the same startup process, right? Or not startup. That's confusing because Didact Engine's already gone through its startup process. Let's say it's going to go through the same absorption process, for lack of a better term. You know, so it's got a new version of your flow library, right? It's going to go through the same process as I mentioned a second ago. It will instantiate all of your flows inside of your flow library and run the configure async method for all of your flows. Okay. It'll configure all those to the database, right? Which will have flow versions associated with them. There will be flow versions that are attached to those things. Okay. And as long as Didact Engine keeps a cached list of what execution versions it's allowed to actually execute, it should still know what it can run and what it cannot run, right? Shouldn't it still be able to track both of those things? It should know what it can do, and it should know what it cannot do. I think it should be able to keep up with both of those, right? So it should know, like, preemptively if it can grab a flow run or not, because it's going to have a cache of like what flows are even like located inside of it in the first place. Let me go to the, let's go back to the, let's go back to that plugin. I think it's in Didact Engine. Let's go back to plugin container. Nope, plugin container singular. There we go. It's going to have plugin execution versions. A collection of plugin execution versions. That's a good question here. Because, like, okay, the thing is, right, all of the flow libraries can be published to different environments as well. I think deployments should be tied to an environment, right? I think the environment entity is tied to a library deployment. Am I right about that? Yep, sure is. So going back to iPlugin container, that's the plugin execution version, right? So question about this, you know, should I have the environment ID? Should that be tied to it, I wonder? Wow, I'll tell you guys, that's a really tough one. Kind of going back to some flow here, and I keep asking myself, can we get away with one version that's only at the flow level, you know, and we can just leave it there? Does that actually make sense? Does that actually make sense? You know, you could do smart versioning, right? There's nothing, for example, that says you couldn't do a concatenated version, kind of like what I've got on my screen here. If it's just one version field that's a string, there's nothing stopping you from doing like some kind of concatenated version. You know, you could be kind of smart about it. I think that's the question right now. Can we get away with just one version? Do we truly need to have two versions that are tracked inside of Didact? You know, and can we get away from... Can we get away from this entity right here. Can we get rid of this? Is it possible to get rid of that? I'm not sure. Could we get rid of that? You know, what if we came in here and we did like a, oh, I don't know. Let's say a public string library main DLL name or something. Or we could just say, I mean, we could just say consistent, right? Just could be the assembly name of the main DLL. This would be the name of the flow library DLL, main DLL. You know, could we do that? Can we add this field to the library deployment entity and completely get rid of the library entity? Could we just ditch that entirely? And on the library deployment, could we also do like what would it be? Like a public, I guess it would be like a GUID. Maybe like a push ID, kind of like in Git. This would always be the latest push ID value from Didact CLI. You know, and that way we avoid a secondary version table for deployments. Like, we just bypass it completely. I don't know that we would want to save, you know, previous push IDs. I don't know that we would actually need that. It would kind of be more like a notifier. Like, we could just notify, you know, the library deployment entity here, like, hey, we've pushed a new library deployment up. So I'm going to change the push ID, kind of like in Git. Like, let's say it's just the most recent push ID. And then Didact Engine is checking this library deployment table in the SQL database. And it's always looking to see if it's missing any push IDs. And if it is, it's just always going to auto-load, you know, the deployment, you know, a second time. And it'll go through the same options again, right? It will it'll grab those deployment files from wherever they're located. It will grab them, and then it will load them into a runtime folder that it creates. It'll load everything through the plugin. It will start instantiating all the flows inside of your flow library. It'll run the configure async methods for all your flows. When the configure async methods are run, it's going to get the flow configurators from inside of the configure async method. And I can build internally inside of Didact a list of all the versions by which, you know, this flow can be ran. And then I could stuff those into cache inside of Didact Engine. Didact Engine should always be able to tell, you know, which flow run it can run and which one it cannot. Somehow Didact has to know what it can run and what it can't. Let me just type some notes up over here. I gotta really think about this. Sometimes I actually find talking to ChatGPT is kind of useful just to bounce ideas off of. Let's see what my little buddy ChatGPT says. It's just a really good idea, guys, sometimes to bounce ideas off of. I hate to tell you guys, I may have to cut it off here. I have to really think about this. This is an ugly, ugly problem. And once I figure this out, we'll be able to push forward with V1, hopefully get this thing finished quickly. Well, sorry we couldn't figure out more tonight. Just kind of going over architecture and all that. Just trying to think about what makes the most sense for these deployments. I've just got to figure these out and we can push forward and finish V1. Just got to really think about how I want this to look in a data model. That's a tough one. That's truly, truly a tough one. I'm going to give my brain a break, go get something to eat. We'll come back to it. Maybe I'll do the live stream maybe tomorrow. Or if not tomorrow, then we could do one like say Monday or something. I think I may try to do another one tomorrow. This is good. This is really good stuff. Frustrating. It's difficult. It's just masterful, awesome stuff. Just really painful to architect. Trying to figure it out myself. That's okay though. That's all right. Listen, thanks for joining in. Appreciate your time. And come join the next one. Come chat. Love to talk to early adopters while I finish building out, Didact version 1. And be on the lookout. Make sure to follow Didact on all of its socials so you can keep up with live streams and any announcements that I make. You can go to the Didact website and scroll down to the very bottom. You'll see a list of socials there. I've got a Twitter profile. I've even got a dedicated subreddit for Didact. Excuse me. Got this YouTube channel here where this live stream is being broadcast from. LinkedIn page for the Didact. All sorts of good stuff. So make sure to go to the didact.dev homepage and give me a follow on all these socials so you can keep up to date. And for the moment, I think I'm going to hop off the live stream and see you guys again real soon. Sorry it's been so long, but I'm already looking forward to the next one. All right, thanks for tuning in. Take it easy. See ya.